All righty, guys. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's installment of the 2023 Coastal Lecture Series. For those of you who are joining us for your very first time tonight, first and foremost, thank you. And second, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Zach Judd. I'm the Director of Education at Florida Oceanographic Society. And for all of you, whether you're first-timers or you've been here for decades, we are thrilled to have you in attendance tonight. I am really excited to let you know that our attendance numbers week after week after week have been through the roof. We've been averaging about 300 attendees for each of our lectures between here at the Blake Library as well as our online audience watching from home on Zoom tonight. So again, we would not be able to do these programs without the phenomenal support of our community. If you guys didn't want to come out and learn about the environment, we wouldn't be able to have incredible speakers come out and teach you. So thank you very much. I do, out of curiosity, want to see how many of you are with us for your very first Coastal Lecture Series program tonight. A couple of you, very good. Thank you for joining us. I'm hopeful that for those of you who raised your hand as first-time attendees, I'm hopeful that you will be back again. We are approaching the end of our lecture series. Can you believe that we only have 2 more presentations left after tonight? I know, boo, right? But I will say, for those of you who are just learning about this series, all of our previous lectures are available as video recordings on our website. So we had a really nice lineup this year, and if you'd like to go back and watch some of the previous presentations, swing by our Coastal Lecture Series website, and you can watch them at your leisure from home. All right, now's the important part of the night. This is where I get to introduce our guest speaker. Tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Lorraine Simpson, is the Senior Scientist and Director of Scientific Research and Conservation at Florida Oceanographic Society. Dr. Simpson holds a bachelor's degree from California State University, Sacramento, a master's degree from Villanova University, and a PhD from the University of Florida. Much of Dr. Simpson's research is focused on mangrove ecology, but her work also encompasses other critical estuarine ecosystems, including seagrass meadows and oyster reefs. Dr. Simpson and her team of scientists are responsible for all of the important research and restoration work being carried out by Florida Oceanographic Society. Tonight, Dr. Simpson will be telling us a little bit about some of that work with a particular focus on seagrass. I am excited to introduce to all of you Dr. Lorraine Simpson.
Wow. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Yay! So wonderful to see you all here, especially just coming to talk about seagrass. Not a lot of people get really excited about seagrass, so seeing all your faces out here. Unfortunately, I can't see you on Zoom, but I'm just so glad everyone is here to learn a little bit more about these really important ecosystems in the Indian River Lagoon. And so before I start, I really want to acknowledge everybody that has made this talk possible. A lot of the research that I talk about is done in collaboration with multiple other organizations in the Indian River Lagoon, as well as just Florida in general. And this research, as Zach mentioned, could not be done without the robust team that we have. We have a lot of great scientists in the research department, and most of the stuff that you hear today is directly a result of them. And we also thank all the volunteers. We have so many passionate volunteers that come through the center, and they help in some respect within our programs, whether it's seagrass or oysters, education programs. So, this talk is not possible without all of those people and the funding sources. There's a lot of money that has gone into this research and restoration, and without a lot of these big funders, we wouldn't be here having this conversation today. So I just want to thank them first. So what's the roadmap? Where are we going with this today? So I figure that there's probably a lot of people in the Zoom-verse that maybe not don't know that much about the Indian River Lagoon. So we're going to start, give a little overview of that. Then we're going to move into seagrasses. We're going to go back to basic elementary seagrass ecology 101, probably 8th grade level, because that basis is really going to help tell the story of the restoration and the research that we do in the IRL. Then I'll talk about our programming in the research department. So we have a multi-tiered approach where we are very robust in our monitoring program, propagation and cultivation of seagrass, as well as research and our restoration and conservation of these important ecosystems. And then the final slide, because everyone wants to know, what can we do to help? How can we love our lagoon as we leave this room today? So the Indian River Lagoon. Wait, how many people in the audience out here are from Florida? From Florida. All right, okay. How many people have moved to Florida within the last 10 years? Awesome. How many people are just down for the season? All right, perfect. So let's start with the Indian River Lagoon. So the Indian River Lagoon is 156 miles long, and it takes up about 40% of Florida's coastal or Atlantic coast. And so it starts up at Ponce Inlet, comes all the way down to the Jupiter Inlet. So this is Jupiter up to New Smyrna Beach. This covers about 7 counties and 39 incorporated cities. And so there's a lot of stakeholders that live along this Indian River Lagoon. It's actually not a river at all. It's a little bit of a misnomer. So this is actually a shallow water body estuary or a lagoon. So when we say river, there's no flow from north to south like there would be in the Mississippi or south to north like there is in the St. Johns. It actually is all tidally influenced or wind driven. And so essentially you have these barrier islands that come down the coast, and the Indian River Lagoon is sandwiched between those barrier islands and the mainland. And it's a very, very dynamic ecosystem because of that. So you have these inlets, you have these 5 inlets that punctuate the barrier islands. And then on the land side, you have 5 rivers that drain all the fresh water from inland Florida, as well as multiple canals. And so because of that, you have a brackish water system. And what that means is the water isn't 100% salt water, so 30 to 37 parts per thousand salt, and it isn't fresh, it's a mixture. And that mixture depends on the day and the time and the season. And so a really good example of this is the Sebastian Inlet. So you can see here, this is the Sebastian Inlet. It brings in salt water into the Indian River Lagoon, and then you have the St. Sebastian River that empties out with fresh water. This is where all of that mixing happens, and this is a very important piece to the puzzle of our seagrasses. So because of this very dynamic ecosystem, because of this brackish water, this was historically one of the most biodiverse estuaries in all of North America. Go us, like amazing. There was about 4,400 species of plants and animals that found its home here. And this is because of that salinity tolerance, right? So you have some species that can live in freshwater, some species that can live in saltwater, some species that can live in a mixture of that. But we're also right on the cusp of the tropical zone that moves into the subtropical up to the temperate zone. So you have species down here in Jupiter Inlet that would never be able to survive up in the Ponce Inlet. And so this is why we have so many amazing species in this area. Because of that, the Indian River Lagoon actually generates about $7.6 billion in revenue. And this is due to people's livelihoods, essentially. People live here, people have jobs here, a lot of industry. Many people come down to visit, like some of you in this room. So we have our tourism opportunities and our recreational opportunities. And this industry is really driven by these coastal ecosystems. Something as simple as seagrass is really the economic driver for these 7 counties and these 39 incorporated cities. So within the Indian River Lagoon, there are 3 main foundation species are mangroves, oysters, and seagrasses. And while I would love to sit here and talk about mangroves all day, we're going to talk about seagrass. Because unfortunately, I feel like some of us might be in the room because of this statistic. Since 2009, about 58% of our seagrasses in the Indian River Lagoon have disappeared. They've died. There's been a huge mortality event. And that mortality event you may have heard of due to the unexpected manatee mortality that has happened since starting about 2021. There's been 1,800 manatees that have died, and they have died due to starvation. There's no question about it. And it's because of this lack of seagrass, which is their main food source. So to kind of illustrate this, this is a picture looking down of aerial imagery of Sewell's Point. And here in 2010, if you look in this general area kind of down by the inlet, this is the St. Lucie Inlet, right in here we have all this beautiful green patches. Don't focus up here, this is mostly deep water. So this is 2010, this is all seagrasses. Fast forward to 2021, all that seagrass is completely gone. Now it's just a barren sand flat that is constantly being kicked up as the waves move through it. This is why we're seeing, number one, the manatees starve, but also two, we're also seeing a lot of other really important ecosystem services that might not be readily obvious to the naked eye that we're losing because of this. But as being a scientist, I want to show you the graph from where this came from, because this is very important to wrap your mind around. So this data has been collected by St. John's River starting back in 1992. The researchers that started this program to do seagrass monitoring in 1992, people thought they were insane. There's seagrass everywhere. Why do we need to monitor it? Don't worry about it. Well, look where we are now. Thank goodness we have this data set. So on this X or this Y-axis, we have extent, and this is aerial extent of seagrass. So they'll go and they'll do aerial flights, and they'll kind of calculate how much seagrass they see across that entire 156 miles of the IRL. So these are your green bars. Here, right around 2010, you see a huge decline. We had a big harmful algal bloom in 2010. It kind of pops back up, and then back in 2016, we see another huge decline, and that was due to another harmful algal bloom. What is more important and more telling, though, is not just looking at this aerial data, it's this black line. This is the percent cover, and so you can see mean cover over here on this y-axis. This is ground truth data by a multitude of researchers. They go out in the summer and the winter time, and they put their head in the water to see what's really going on. And you can see back here in 2010, we had about 17% of seagrass coverage. That's a nice, healthy seagrass coverage. This is what we would hope that we can get back to today. If you look down here today, we're at 2%. That's devastating. And this is what it looks like if you were to put your head in the water. 2010, 16%, beautiful. This is where all the crabs are hiding, so the redfish can go eat on them. This is where the manatees are eating. 2010, it's a barren moonscape. There is no place for those benthic infauna. There's no place for the invertebrates. Where are the sea trout going to go feed? Where are the manatees going to feed? So it's this loss of structure that is leading to a loss of ecosystem services that is very, very scary and is much more telling than the manatee mortality event. So to really tell the story, though, we need to, like I said, we need to step back and we need to go back to Seagrass Ecology 101, because understanding the life history of seagrass is really critical to understanding the story. So seagrasses, I'm sure you all know, is a flowering plant. This is just the same exact thing that you have up in your garden, let's say your turf grass, but it just is able to grow underwater. And so because of that, because it's a flowering plant, it needs to photosynthesize, so it needs to pull energy from the sun's rays. In order to do that, we need to have clean water. If you have dirty water, if it's mucky water, those sun rays are not able to penetrate, and they are not able to give energy to the seagrass species. So this is very important to this tale that we're telling today. Another very interesting piece to these seagrasses is that they don't necessarily reproduce via seed in the Indian River Lagoon. So this is very different than the stories you might have heard from the Chesapeake. The seagrass in the Chesapeake is a prolific seed bearer. You can take buckets of seed and dump it over the side of a boat, and some of it will establish and your seagrass will come back. Here, these little things, no one has actually really seen a seagrass flower. I was just at a conference last week, and a researcher has been working in the Indian River Lagoon on seagrass for 46 years. He's only seen 2 flowers. Wow. So what does that mean? That means that there's no seeds that we can harvest from these to plant. In order to plant, we need pieces of seagrass to do that. Because that seagrass, if we plant it, it will grow. But if there's no seagrass to be had in the Indian River Lagoon, where are we now? Now, there is some sort of seed bank in the Indian River Lagoon, because when the water quality is there, the seagrass comes back. But the very interesting part is because of the fact that we weren't prepared for this die-off, a lot of the researchers have been caught back on their heels, and we have no idea where the seed bank is, what these seeds look like, how they've got there, how long they last. And so there's this whole big push in restoration research and ecology right now to really understand what is happening and how our seagrasses are coming back in the IRL. Another important piece to understanding our seagrasses is the growth is seasonal. So the growing season for seagrasses is April through September, and the dormancy period is October through March. And so you can see this in this graph here. We have 2 different species. We have Thalassia and Syringodium, a standing crop on the y-axis in abundance, and then year. The most important thing to take away from this, though, you don't get bogged down in the numbers, is this oscillating fraction that you can see here. In the summertime, you have high standing crop and high abundance, and in the wintertime, you can kind of see that it dies back. And so just because it's not there doesn't mean that it's not just waiting for the next growing season. I have so many people that call me and say, oh, Lorraine, my seagrass at my dock, it's gone. Well, it's December. If you don't see it in August, please call me back because we definitely need to come and check it out because something isn't right. Another important piece is seagrasses, because they live in this brackish water ecosystem, this Indian River Lagoon, they live in a very narrow salinity range. They adapted to live between 14 parts per thousand and 35, depending on the species. But on average, a lot of the main species that we're really interested in, they like to live right around 23 parts per thousand. If you go above that, you're going to stress out the seagrass. It's not going to be able to be productive, and it might die. If you go below that, if the water is too fresh, you're going to get the same thing. And you can see this in this leaf extension rate graph for Syringodium, which is the manatee grass. On the y-axis, you have leaf extension rate. On the x, you have salinity from 0 up to 50. At 5, 10, 15 parts per thousand, it's doing okay. It's still kind of growing. But its sweet spot is here, right in 20 to 25 parts per thousand. And then as you move up in salinity, then you start to see a decline in that seagrass productivity. And so it's very important when thinking about the water quality in the Indian River Lagoon and the swings that we can see in salinity, that we need to remember that seagrass is only going to be in a very narrow range. In the Indian River Lagoon, we have 7 species of seagrass, which is really one of the reasons why we're one of the most biodiverse estuaries in all of North America. Most of the areas in Florida, as well as the rest of the United States, have 2 to 3 species. So this is really incredible. People come from all around the world to come look at our seagrasses. And there's 2 different kind of subsets of seagrasses. We have our smaller Halophila species, and these are kind of short-lived, they move in quickly, kind of the early successional species. And then we have our larger species, where our shoalgrass, our manatee grass, and our turtle grass. These are longer lived, they're the slower turnover. These are the species that we're really used to thinking about when we're talking about the seagrasses in the IRL. These are the thick ones that if you ever went wading as a fisherman, these are the ones that would get caught around your ankles. This is the ones that all the fish like to spend their time in. So these are our canopy-forming species, our most important ones. And so these canopy-forming species, these are really the foundation species, the ones that are providing all of these important ecosystem services along our coastal zone. And so what are those ecosystem services besides feeding manatees? Well, there's important ones. And an ecosystem service, just to be clear, is a service, output, or process provided by a natural system that benefits humans. So these ecosystem services are driving that $7.6 billion industry here in the Indian River Lagoon. And so a few of them: essential habitat and nursery grounds for a lot of our commercially and recreationally important fish species, and other species as well, whether it's turtles or sharks. And so without having that percent cover, that beautiful, rich canopy of species, you've lost that, right? And you've lost the home for the fish that are important to us. This is also a really important food source for obviously our manatees, but also for turtles and a lot of fish. Turtles actually, they don't get enough credit for doing a lot of the predation on these species. They're little hungry guys, and they eat a lot of the seagrass in the IRL. This is also really important for sediment stabilization. So think about that picture I showed earlier with Sewell's Point, where all of that seagrass was gone. It was just kind of a white kind of moonscape. So as waves move over that, because there's no seagrass to hold down that sediment is constantly being kicked back up. And as as the sediment is being kicked up, it's moving around. And as that happens, you're not going to get seagrass that's able to facilitate there because it doesn't have stabilization. You may not get other species, say clams, to be able to settle there due to filtration. And so it's really important to stabilizing the sediment. It's also very important when thinking about shoreline erosion. And so you think about these seagrass species that are along the coast, right? Those thick canopy-forming seagrass species that get caught around your legs when you're wade fishing, As the water moves over that, it slows down the trajectory of that water before it hits the shoreline. And in doing so, it's decreasing the amount of erosion that could take place if that seagrass wasn't there. So by slowing down the wave attenuation, we are seeing a dampening of shoreline erosion because of our seagrass species. Another important ecosystem service is the biogeochemical cycling of these species. So nutrients, seagrasses, just due to turnover of nutrients, they were able to change or alter the nutrient ratios of something so other organisms can use it. They're also really important for carbon sequestration. So these species are pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and they're storing it in their biomass for either a short term or long term in their sediments. And that is really important in terms of climate change mitigation, right? So the global warming, the more CO2 we can pull out of the atmosphere, the better. And these guys are really, really good at doing that. So these species, as I mentioned, the canopy-forming species, these are the ones that are really driving all of those ecosystem services. But unfortunately, just along with this decline in seagrass that we've been seeing, that 58%, it's the species shift, too, that is very upsetting when you think about it. So this is data that is pulled from Vero Beach down to Stewart. And we have species cover, so the amount of each species that is found in these transects from 1998 to 2022. Halophila, those are those really tiny species that I mentioned. They don't do much, they're there, they're very important, but they're not really driving those ecosystem services, as opposed to Haliduli, Syringodium, and Thalassia, our canopy-forming species. You can see in the blue, Halophila, they kind of hangs on, it's always there, it's doing its job. But the big shift that we're seeing are the Syringodium and Thalassia have pretty much almost completely disappeared from this part of the lagoon. And that is the food for the manatees, and that is the habitat for our fish species. And so this is difficult to see because those species take a long time to come back. You know, these aren't the short-lived species that come in quickly. There was actually some trajectory data that was looked at where if we were to have the increase in seagrass that we saw from 2010 to 2016, right before that big crash, if we were to translate that to today, it's going to take 16 to 22 years for us to get back to the 2009 levels of seagrass with these canopy-forming species. That's a long time, and I don't know if the manatees have all that time. So why? Why is this happening? Well, what are the threats to seagrasses? And these are threats not only to the seagrasses here in the Indian River Lagoon, but these are threats to seagrasses globally. And it just really depends where you are in the world. But here in the Indian River Lagoon, I'm going to start with the two kind of smaller ones and then talk about the big one. So the first is disturbance. And this can be human disturbance. This can be physical disturbance, i.e. hurricanes. And essentially what happens is whether it's a boat scar or a boat prop scar or a hurricane, it will come through and rip up the seagrass. And because that seagrass is not able to seed, it might have a hard time getting back and kind of filling in these areas. For example, here, this is a picture taken from the Keys. These are big prop scars from boats. What happens when these boats come through? They rip the seagrass up, it floats away and probably dies, but now they've made a very deep incision in the seagrass meadow. And oftentimes, that is below the zone that seagrass is able to survive. It's not going to necessarily grow down. It might be too deep. And so the only way to fix this is for someone to manually go out and fill in that prop scar and plant seagrass on top of that, which is a very costly and time-intensive activity. Another disturbance or another threat to seagrasses is predation. Yes, I know that this is an important food source for these species, but if the species are stressed, predation is not going to help them. And so this is a great picture. This was taken, I believe, from the Bahamas. This is a researcher that was looking at turtle predation. So she caged seagrass, and then, as you can see, the seagrass that is caged looks fantastic. The seagrass on the outside of the cage has been completely mowed down by some very industrious little turtles. Now, this is okay in a perfect world, right? If Mother Nature is perfectly in balance, this is fine. The turtle will move on. This will be able to grow back within the growing season, and the next year, the turtle can come back and dine again. But if there's not enough seagrass in the system, the turtle is going to keep coming back to this area and keep eating it down. And if there's not any of that biomass that's able to photosynthesize, that seagrass is eventually going to die. And so oftentimes, something like this, you can see the seagrass be completely killed in just one growing season. But the main reason that we're here today talking about the seagrass decline is water quality. And unfortunately, this is a conversation that needs its own PowerPoint presentation. And I'm just going to gloss over it very quickly because there's a lot to unpack here. But essentially, Florida, we have a lot of people that are moving here and a lot of people that have been moving here. And in order to live here, we really needed to drain some of the central Florida, right? And so historically, water would come from Lake Kissimmee down through Lake Okeechobee and then move down through the River of Grass into the Everglades. But in order to farm, in order to live, in order to have cattle, we put a dam around Lake Okeechobee. And now all the water either comes out of the St. Lucie estuary here in Stuart, Florida, or it will be shunted out the Caloosahatchee on the west coast. And so what does that mean exactly? What does that mean that we have altered the way that water moves through the state? Well, it goes back to that Seagrass 101. The first main thing is our freshwater input to a system that is really meant to be brackish water. And so as this water is either released out of the C44 canal through the St. Lucie estuary, or if it's coming through a lot of our canals, as you move north, there's canals like the C25 and Fort Pierce. This is draining central Florida, especially after big rains. And so you're altering the timing, distribution, and volume of fresh water that makes it into the system. So that is altering that very fine balance of salinity that seagrass can grow in, right? If we're having long periods of rain that are being shunted out into these canals, that's going to stress the seagrass. This picture right here is from Taylor Creek in Fort Pierce. You can see this plume of water. So this is all fresh water being drained. With that fresh water is also coming this huge sediment plume. And so if you have this sediment plume and it lasts for multiple days, that's effectively going to not allow the seagrass to be able to photosynthesize, and it can become stressed and could potentially die because of this. Now, what else is coming in with this freshwater inflow that is moving off of the land? Nutrients. So here, when we're talking about draining central Florida, we're talking about increased nutrient loading from that freshwater inflows. There's also a lot of outdated infrastructure along the Indian River Lagoon. There's stormwater drains that literally take water right off of the road and drop it into the IRL. We have a lot of houses that are still in septic tanks, and the water just leaches through a drain field out into the Indian River Lagoon. And so what does that mean? Why is this so important? Because seagrasses, they can't utilize those nutrients in the water column, right? That nutrients are kind of floating around freeform. In order for the seagrass to utilize it, it needs to be down in the sediments. What is able to utilize these nutrients, though, in the water column if it's not seagrass? It's those naturally occurring algae, cyanobacterias, and diatoms. So these are the critters that are floating around. They've always been there. But when you give them nutrients, just like if we were to give our plant a nutrient, it starts to churn out some more biomass and it starts to overproliferate. This is a big deal, especially in the summertime when it gets hot. And so things start working more and you're seeing these huge algal blooms that happen. This is an algal bloom. It looks like pea soup. It's smelly, it's thick, and it can shade out seagrass, and it can last for weeks to months. And so how does this happen? This is a very simplified infographic. We have nutrients that are coming off the land. They're fueling these algae blooms. This is blocking the sunlight, so you're killing the seagrass. As you're killing the seagrass, at the same time, the algae is actually dying too, because it's part of its life cycle, right? It can only sustain so much as it's replicating. This is dying. It's going to the bottom of the IRL, and it's actually using up all the oxygen. So it's completely changing the dissolved oxygen layer, and it's killing the fish. So now you have dead fish, dead algae, and dead seagrass. So what does that mean? All of those things are now releasing nutrients back into the water column. So you have this cyclical pattern that's happening all because we're starting with this fertilizer that's running off the land. And so when it's all said and done, we are seeing this huge decline of seagrasses because of these harmful algal blooms. And they've been pinpointed to the 2010 and the 2016. And this is where our story begins and hopefully will start to end. This is also really important due to water turnover in the Indian River Lagoon. And so as I mentioned earlier, this Indian River Lagoon starts up here in Ponce Inlet down to Jupiter, 156 miles. If you can train your eye really here, we have Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge and Sebastian Inlet. Merritt Island, Sebastian. So the colors that you're looking at right here, that's the water, okay? There are different turnover rates in the Indian River Lagoon depending on the proximity to an inlet, so where that salt water can come in. Down here in Sebastian Inlet, you have this beautiful blue, kind of integrates to green. The blue to green is 3 months to a year that water can sit in one area. As you move north to the northern Indian River Lagoon, you're seeing residence times of water from 2 to 2.5 years. So if you have an algal bloom that has started in an area, it could sit there for months to years before it's ever able to be flushed out of the system. And because of that, that's why we've seen a huge loss of seagrass in this northern IRL. A lot of the data, that 58%, has really been driven by the coastal areas in Brevard County. And so this is what it looked like. This is where we are now. What the heck are we going to do? What are all of these organizations along the Indian River Lagoon working towards in hopes to get our seagrasses back to that 2009 level? So at Florida Oceanographic, we have a program called the FOSTER program, which stands for Florida Oceanographic Seagrass Training, Education, and Research and Restoration. As you can see, I don't get stuck down with those because I'm more interested in the tiers under the FOSTER program, and that's monitoring, propagation and cultivation, research, and then the restoration and conservation. And so all of these things work together to drive our understanding of where we were and where we are headed. And so I'm going to go through each of these very briefly to just kind of showcase what FOS does, but also, this is happening in conjunction with many organizations, and this is why we are moving in the direction that we are. So the first is monitoring. Let's go back to that graph that I showed earlier, that St. Johns River water management data. So this, as I mentioned, was started back in 1994, 1992 by some researchers that everyone said was absolutely insane for doing this. And they got together, and there are actually 103 transect sites within the Indian River Lagoon. And all of these organizations get together, well, not together, but go out twice a year, once in the dry season, so in the wintertime, and once in the wet season, the summertime. And we put our head in the water to monitor that seagrass. Because if we didn't monitor that seagrass, we wouldn't have that graph, that data set, to talk about where we need to be and what has happened. So this is a major collaboration between so many people in the Indian River Lagoon, and it's just very empowering to be able to show this today because it's great to show that there's just so much collaboration within all the organizations. Now, as scientists though, as much as we would love to be out there every day with our head in the water, we can't. And so at Florida Oceanographic, we actually started a volunteer program where we asked industrious volunteers to go out monthly and look at the seagrass for us, especially between that growing season, so April through September. So we have some volunteers, there's about 20 of them. We teach them everything they need to know about transects and quadrats and all the different species. And then once we have given them all their pieces to the puzzle, we send them on their way, and they each have their own site, and they send us data every month, and we're able to make great graphs. And these graphs are amazing for us because it's these very specific or these very tiny pieces of data that can really help us understand what's happening. Right now everything looks great. This is actually from September of 2021 to May of 2022. As we watch these every month when the data comes in, we plot it, and it looks great. But if there was a month where all of a sudden all of the turtle grass was completely gone, we know, oh man, we need to get out there right now and go have a look. And so it's really amazing to have these volunteers that are kind of the eyes on the lagoon for us when we can't be out there all the time. Another really important piece to the foster program and to restoration and research in general in the Indian River Lagoon is propagation and cultivation of the seagrasses. Remember I mentioned that we can't use seeds, and so where do we get our seagrass stock? A lot of the work that used to be done when seagrass was plentiful is someone would go to one site, dig up seagrass, and then move it to another. Or if there was a research project, you can easily go out and destructively sample something and no one cared. That is not the case anymore because there's not enough seagrass for that to happen. And so the only way that we can grow seagrass is from fragments. And so we have a volunteer program where we ask volunteers if they're walking the shoreline of the Indian River Lagoon and they find a piece of seagrass, doesn't matter what species it is, if it has a root on it, especially, a rhizome would be even better, but if there's that root nodule and some above ground biomass, if they can bring it back to us, we will then plant it. So this is an example, this is a rack line, this is not real seagrass, this is clip art, but this is the idea, right? And people will go out, they'll take their kids or they'll go on a walk with their dog and they will bring us back just random pieces of seagrass all the time, which is wonderful. Then we take that seagrass and we plant it in our seagrass nursery. So we have 34 tanks right now that provide 350 square feet of planting space, and that seagrass lives its best life. So it has the perfect conditions, and because of that, we actually have 4 of the 7 seagrass species right now in stock. So we have all of the canopy-forming species in the IRL. And so this is very important, not only for restoration and research for FOS, but for all the other organizations that are working towards that throughout the IRL. Now, we can't get to all the seagrass all the time. You know, there's a lot of it that grows, especially when it's given its best life. And so once it outgrows each of those tanks, we transfer it into this wet lab area. So this is a flow-through area off the back side of our game fish lagoon. This is where all the seagrass, or the turtles and sharks and fish live. This is the most important part to me, though. We don't have any critters in there, and so a lot of people don't get really excited when I want to show it to them, but I'm glad you guys are here so I can share it with you. So this is 5,300 square feet of seagrass. There's a lot of seagrass in here, and it's all one species, but this is ready to go out into the lagoon when the time is right. When the water quality is there, we are poised and ready to help restore the IRL. And how do we do that? So many organizations have come up with different ways to do that. Some people will take the seagrass and bare root plant it right into the ground. Some people will plant the seagrass in peat pots and just plant the whole pot. Some people use bamboo skewers and just kind of skewer it into the ground. We use this restoration unit as which is a biodegradable mat. So it's a 20 by 20 piece of burlap, essentially. And we pull seagrass from our wet lab, and we have volunteers come out, and they very meticulously help us put the seagrass on the mat with floral wire. And that floral wire and that mat will go into the lagoon, and it will biodegrade. Last year, we had volunteers help us construct 3,000 mats in 2022, and this year, we're pushing about 4,500 mats. We could not do what we're doing without them, but this is also an amazing way to get the community involved, to involve them in the resource, because that is the way that we're going to promote environmental stewardship. We don't have to put it on a mat, right? It doesn't need to be on a mat, but bringing people in to tell the story of seagrass and to tell the plight of the IRL, this is the best way to do it, and we're so very grateful that we have so many people that come out to help. So when we're done constructing our 3,000 mats or our 4,500 mats this year, what do we do next? Well, we take it out to the Indian River Lagoon and we plant it. We essentially just take that mat, we push it down to the sediment, and then we put bamboo skewers in all the corners. And that kind of cements it down to the sediment, and that gives it, it kind of facilitates it to root within the sediment. And so the burlap mat will actually break down and be buried in a few weeks or up to 12 months. And that seagrass will establish very quickly if given the opportunity. In some cases, we've seen 90% establishment of these mats in just 3 months, which is absolutely phenomenal. So the restoration technique works, and we are ready with all of our volunteers and this restoration practice for when the time is right. And so what do we need to do for restoration? Because of what's happening right now. I have a lot of people that call me and say, Lorraine, please come and plant seagrass in my backyard or off my dock. We would love to be a part of the program. What can we do moving forward? And because of how dynamic the Indian River Lagoon is, unfortunately, seagrass restoration is not as easy as one would like it to be. It's not like going and planting a garden. Just the IRL is so dynamic, and it's a little bit fussy sometimes, that can make our job hard. And so we do a lot of work up front to try to find the best place to plant seagrass in the IRL. And so water quality is key, right? This is why we are where we are. So we're not going to plant seagrass in a very freshwater system. So we're not going to plant it right at the mouth of a river, or we're not going to plant it in a canal that is draining areas west of town. We're also going to make sure that the water is very clear. And so once again, we're probably not going to plant it if there's going to be a sediment plume that comes out of a canal or in some backwater area that doesn't get tidally flushed very often. And to illustrate this point, I want to show a little experiment that we did a few years ago. So we took 16 shoots of seagrass and we planted them in our mesocosms at FOS. And so it's hard to discern, but in each one of these little containers, there's 16 shoots of seagrass. Then we took multiple tanks and we covered them with all of the seagrass shoots with different levels of shade cloth. So we had 100% sun, so no shade cloth. So all of the resources from the sun are making it through that water because the water is very clear. Then we had a 55% shade. So we shaded it 55%. That's our medium level. And then we had our 25%, which is our low level. What did we see? Well, after 4 months, we went back, we harvested it all, we took all of them out. Here on the y-axis, we have shoot count from 0 to 220. Then we have our months, so May through September. The highlight treatment, the one that did not have any shading, went from 16 shoots to 200 shoots in 4 months. That's almost a 1,200% increase. If we give Mother Nature the chance, she will repair herself. We just need to give her the chance with clean water. Unfortunately, the other treatments did not fare as well. So our medium light treatment, it survived. It kept around 20. It wasn't very happy, but it was okay. Our low light treatment, that 25%, died after 2 months. It held on the first month. By month 2, it was completely gone. And the data actually shows in the IRL that anything less than 27% for a prolonged period of time will shade the seagrass and die. And so this is just really driving home the point that water quality is the key to seagrass restoration in the Indian River Lagoon. There's some other spatial factors to consider when doing this work. And one is, was there seagrass there before? You know, we need to go back to that data that St. John's River has been collecting. If there was seagrass there before, it's probably an okay place to plant it again. If there was never seagrass there, Mother Nature is telling us something. Do not plant it there. It's not going to bode well for it. Sediment type is also very important. Seagrasses like to live in a sandy sediment, nice, coarse, fine-grained sand. They do not like muck. Muck is not an issue down here for the most part in the southern Indian River Lagoon, but as you move north with that changing of hydrology, there's a big muck problem. So this is kind of an unconsolidated sediment. The roots will not be able to bind to that sediment, so it's not going to establish well. And there's also a lot of biogeochemical processes that are happening in that muck. It makes it very anoxic, and the seagrass is not able to survive in those low oxygen conditions. So we go out and we look at the sediment to make sure that, number one, the seagrass was there, and number two, the sediment can support the seagrass we're going to plant. Another important piece is intertidal location. We can't just plant seagrass everywhere. Seagrass lives in a very narrow range, and that has to do with that clear water that we spoke about. So seagrass like to live in 0.5 to 0.9 meters, which is up to about 3 feet in depth. If you plant above that in the shoreline, it's probably going to get ripped up by waves that are constantly crashing, especially during windy times of the year. And due to tidal cycles, it might actually be out of the water for some part of the day and might desiccate and die. If you plant below that 0.9 meters, it might be too deep. The water might be too turbid, and they might not be able to get enough light that's able to penetrate below that 0.9 to sustain the seagrass for long periods of time. And then we have our predation risk. Like I said, there's a lot of hungry critters out there right now, and it's probably not a good idea to plant seagrass in a manatee refuge or an aggregation grounds. It's not going to last very long. We're just basically opening the buffet for them for like 5 minutes. And so you really need to look at the data, the FWC data, and see where are spawning aggregations of fish and where do the manatees winter during the winter time. Another interesting thing that maybe most people don't know is in order to put seagrass back in the lagoon, we actually need to pull state and federal permits. And so we get permits from the state of Florida through the Department of Environmental Protection, and then we also need a US Army Corps permit from the federal side. And these permits are very similar to the ones that you would use to put in a seawall or a dock, which is crazy to me because they're both very different things. But because of this, you just can't go and put seagrass anywhere. There's a lot of rules and regulations that drive this, and unfortunately, a lot of these permits take a long time to get. And so there's a lot of patience that comes from the practitioner side of working through all the avenues to help restore the IRL. Another really interesting piece of seagrass restoration that we've been looking into is co-restoration with other species. So other species in the Indian River Lagoon that probably have crashed as well. So if you think about it, we spoke earlier, there's these foundation species, the bivalves, whether it's oysters and clams and mangroves and seagrasses, they all work together, right? There's a lot of connectivity between them, and all of their ecosystem services likely drive the success of each other. And so if we're going to restore one species, why don't we restore both and use them together to hopefully increase restoration success? And so one of the main things that you may have heard about, this is in the news, is our co-restoration with clams. So unfortunately, our hard clam species, Mercenaria and Mercenaria, has completely crashed in the Indian River Lagoon. There's a lot of stories from Sebastian Inlet, just 10 years ago, where you can go out and get a 5-gallon bucket of these clams. You can't do that anymore. Back in 2019, researchers from the University of Florida, they went out to find clams to produce broodstock. It took them like a year, and they only found 30 clams. Those 30 clams have now been used to make millions of other clams, and those clams, with the idea being that they survived all of the environmental stressors that we threw at them, we're hoping that these new clams that we're putting out in the lagoon are going to be hardy and they'll be able to survive whatever we're throwing at them next. And so there's a lot of work that's looking at planting these clams with the seagrass, with the idea, once again, that these ecosystem services can help each other. So a seagrass is going to provide the clams with protection from predation. It's a lot harder for a red drum or a stingray to move across the sediment surface and just suck the clams out of the ground if there's a nice dense seagrass meadow on top of them. The seagrass is also stabilizing that sediment. So remember we talked about the seagrass the sediment being kicked up if there's nothing holding it in place. Well, the clams need that because they're filter feeders. So if there's constantly sediment in the water column, they're going to try to filter through that, and they're going to slow down their filtration because it's harder to filter when there's heavy sediments in the water column. On the opposite side, the clams are going to provide water quality improvement. So they're filtering the water, right? If we have enough clams out there, can they help clean the water so the water or the seagrass can photosynthesize? And then we're also going to provide nutrients for growth from those clams. So the clams, or the seagrass, cannot pull those nutrients from the water column, right? Like the algae and the cyanobacteria can. But they can pull nutrients from the sediment. And so as the clams defecate, the seagrass is now getting a direct injection of nutrients will hopefully help it grow. And so together, hopefully, if we do this, we're going to see increased survival, growth, and productivity of both of these species. Now, with all of that said and done, we do everything possible to make sure that we're giving the seagrass all of the positive benefits and everything that we can do to help success. Unfortunately, only two-thirds of seagrass restoration, is unsuccessful. And this is a global statistic. So this is just not something that we're dealing with here in the Indian River Lagoon. People are dealing with this globally. And this is, once again, because we're doing this underwater. It's hard. It's very dynamic. And so even though we try everything, we still know that our project might fail. And so that's where the research comes in. we are not in a place right now with our water quality to plant our seagrasses because, unfortunately, the water quality will probably see that failure happen. And so what we do is we do a lot of smaller scale research projects to really understand, number one, how to best propagate and cultivate these seagrasses for future endeavors, but also how to best restore when that time is right. So I want to tell you a little project that we did last year that's really going to hammer home a lot of these points that we just spoke out, unfortunately. And this is a project that, we're going to talk about threats, we're going to talk about natural history of these species, and as well as the restoration. And this was a huge effort by multiple organizations, all hands on deck with the Florida Oceanographic Research Department. And let's just get into it. So the question was, does the presence of that hard clam, Mercenaria mercenaria, our super clam, if we plant that with seagrass, will that help increase restoration success? So to try to tease that apart, we set up an experiment where we did seagrass only plots, and this is our restoration unit, our mat, and then we did seagrass and clams together. So we came in, we planted the clams. If you kind of look closely in this picture, these little white dots, those are the clams. They kind of settle into the sediment, and then we come back and we plant our seagrass on top of it. And so if we can compare the seagrass growth in each of these plots, we can see whether or not the clams helped or hindered the seagrass growth over the duration of the experiment. We also were very interested in understanding whether or not we really need to be caging these from predation risk. Remember, there's a lot of hungry critters out there, and we want to make sure that we're giving the seagrass enough time to establish, hopefully for an entire growing season, in the hopes that we can get this through and then pull the cages out, and there'll be plenty of seagrass that if the manatee or if turtle does come through, it's not going to hurt the success of this restoration project. So we caged half of them. We kind of blew the experiment up and we caged them. We did this up in the northern and central IRL. We did this at 9 sites. So we have 4 up here in the northern IRL basin, and then we have 4 here in the green. This is the central basin. What did we find? Well, our first graph here, we have the northern basin in yellow up top, we have the central basin below in green, and then we have our shoal grass, our Haliduli redii cover on our x-axis. If you squint your eyes and look pretty close, after this 1 month of planting, every single site in the northern IRL died. Come on. It was definitely a huge hit to morale for the team. It was a lot of efforts that happened. But it's water quality. We're talking about this area in the northern lagoon that doesn't flush, has repeated algal blooms. It cannot sustain seagrass at this time. And so moving forward, we just completely took all the cages out. After 1 month, that part of the experiment was completely done. So then we just focused on these central locations. So these are our 5 sites in the central lagoon. At month 2, we pulled the data, so we got 2 months of data out of this, and we looked at those different units, whether the seagrass and clams together. And lo and behold, we have seagrass coverage here on the Y, seagrass only in this bar graph or box plot, and seagrass and clams. The seagrass grew more in plots without the clams. That was opposite of what was supposed to happen. They weren't listening to us when we wrote up all of our reports. And so this really took us back, and this is the best part of science. And even if you think you know what's going on, Mother Nature's always going to throw something at you. And so this was very interesting to us, and because of this finding, we are doing a whole new set of experiments coming this summer, or this spring, essentially, to really tease apart what's happening. Were the clams too big, and as they moved around in the sediment, were they breaking the roots of the seagrass, so the seagrass wasn't established? Or potentially, since we had mats over the clams, were the clams trying to push their siphons up, and they were pushing the mats up, and that was not allowing the seagrass to establish? We don't know yet, but we're going to figure it out, and I can report back later. Another interesting piece, thinking about those threats and thinking about the other part of the experiment, was the caging. Did caging work? Do we need to cage? Because caging is very expensive, and it takes a lot of maintenance Those cages collect everything around them. Every piece of drift algae and barnacle and you name it will end up on the edge of those cages. And if you leave it for long enough, it will change the hydrology in that cage, and you might not get clear water that's able to flow through it. Well, lo and behold, caging helps. Not surprising. There was 3 times more seagrass in the cage plots than there was in the non-cage plots. So those non-cage plots were essentially, we opened the buffet to our manatees and our turtles, and they had a great time, whereas the seagrass in the cage plots was very happy and was growing wonderfully. A note about the cages is you have to put tops on them, because if you don't, the otters have figured out that they can jump in the cage, eat all the clams, and then jump out. But then if you put tops on the cage and they don't have kind of a little tilt in them, the mullet will get stuck up there when they get spooked by the snook, and then you have a dead, rotting mullet on top of your cage. So there's a lot more research that is going into the best caging methods moving forward as well. Now, what happened after this? So this is our 2 months. This is the 5 sites that we were speaking of, on the data that I just showed. Month 4, we lost 3 of our 5 sites. Month 5, we lost all of our sites. Why? Yep. Hurricane Ian came through. Even though Hurricane Ian hit the West Coast and moved in and kind of dissipated over the mainland, we still had tropical-like conditions here, and it dropped a ton of rain in Central Florida. And where did that rain finally make it? Out the canals and out into the Indian River Lagoon. And so now, as those tropical storm conditions, they kicked up the water, kicked up all the sediment, so made the water very turbid. Then you had a freshwater input that just basically it couldn't survive. But we still had 2 sites. We were so excited, okay, we can make it through this growing season, but we couldn't because Hurricane Nicole came through and killed the other 2. So it's all about research, right? Now we're gonna try to plant a little bit earlier in the season. We started this project in June, thinking that was enough time. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe we need to get out there soon, which the water's gonna be very cold, which my team is not very excited about. And so, unfortunately, this project, this case study, falls under that 2/3 unsuccessful rate. And this is really what it feels like. I feel like sometimes I lie in bed, and this is what my mind does. But the hope is that all of this work that our group is doing and other organizations in the Indian River Lagoon can get us here one day. And we won't have to talk about all those failures because we've had such a success. So what are the most important things? What are the most important takeaways of our research and restoration? Well, the one thing is that water quality is going to be our biggest push for restoration in the Indian River Lagoon, right? This is our biggest tool. So while seagrass restoration, we should be doing these things, we really need to be protecting the seagrass beds that we have now and giving those seagrass beds the opportunity to grow. This picture right here is from Fort Pierce, right past Northbridge in September of 2022. Look at that seagrass, it's gorgeous. We had a really dry year last year. It didn't rain as much up until the hurricanes. And the seagrass came back and it was doing fine. Yeah, there's a lot of algae and epiphytes on it, but it's there because it was given the opportunity. And so we just need to really work towards that. Another thing that's really important is these small scale restoration research projects. You know, we are not in the place to restore, but we are in the place to get out in the water and tease apart what we need to do when the time is right. So, what can you guys do to help? Well, there's a lot of things, right? And I think that some are much easier than we may recognize. First and foremost is just learn how to live on the lagoon. You know, there's very simple. Use Florida-friendly landscaping. Please don't fertilize, especially if you live in the sandy shorelines of the IRL. Are you on septic tank? Please work with the county. There's multiple programs to help you convert your septic to sewer. If you have a dog, please pick up your dog waste after, as you're taking your dog on the walk, because those nutrients will make it back into the lagoon. And so if we all work on these very small things, hopefully we can see a change in our water quality. Another thing is I'm speaking to the choir. You guys are all here, and I love that because you're educating yourself. And now you can leave here, and you can educate your family, you can educate your neighbors, you can educate the random person in the grocery store that doesn't want to hear about it, but you're going to tell them anyway. Because that is the only way that we can get the story out. Once again, we have 1,000 people that are moving to Florida a day, and they're showing up, and they're looking at the IRL, and they're thinking that that's what it's supposed to look like. And if we don't tell the story that that is not what it's supposed to look like, and we actually have to work really hard to get it back there, they're never going to hear it. So we need to be the advocates for the IRL. One of the main things to do is, the IRL is along 7 counties. The IRL spans 7 counties. There's a lot of stakeholders. We have to talk to our local representatives, our state representatives, all the people in Tallahassee. Call them, write them, please demand clean water, because if we don't, who is going to? There's not. And then along those lines, please support land conservation initiatives. There's a lot of infrastructure that is moving in, a lot of land is being covered up. And as that happens, that water is no longer able to be recharged to the aquifer or sit in EAAs, and that water gets shunted out to the IRL. And so that is really going to help clean our water as well. If you would like to be more involved, if you would like to see what our advocacy program is doing at FOS, please use your phone, take a picture of this, and check out our page. We have a lot of legislative priorities on there, more ideas on how to love your lagoon, and volunteer opportunities as well. Please come to the center and help us educate each other, but also make mats or help build an oyster reef, because these are the things that are really going to drive our lagoon forward. And so with that, I thank you for listening to the multiple tiers of our Florida Oceanographic Research Department, and I am very, very happy to take any questions. If you are nervous about asking a question, that's okay. Please take down my email address, lsimpson@floridaocean.com, and I'll be happy to answer any questions through email. So with that, thank you.
When I'm going to Fort Pierce, Indian River Lagoon, Indian River Drive, I don't remember exactly where it's at, but at low tide, you can actually see this grass sitting out of the water. It is very, very thick. It's like 3 clumps. It's been there, I know, for 3 years.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the tide comes in and it goes out, and then it's kind of like dry. But I don't know what it is.
So this is a kind of a question comment about some seagrass along the Indian River Lagoon, kind of in the Fort Pierce area, and it sounds like there's 3 distinct clumps of seagrass, and it's thick, and it's been there a while. So there is a species of seagrass called rupia. It's widgeon grass. It is a tricky little thing. It's actually really good at producing seeds. It's the only seagrass that does it. And we don't really talk about widgeon grass because there's these 2 competing groups of scientists. It is a seagrass, it isn't a seagrass, so I just kind of left it out. But this one, because it produces by seeds, oftentimes you will see clumps of it. It's almost like a bunch of seeds got dropped in one spot. It is thick and it is beautiful. The unfortunate thing about widgeon grass, though, rupia, is it's very ephemeral. It will be there one day, and you can go back in 3 weeks, and all of it will be gone. Like, you put your fingers in the ground looking for the roots, and there's nothing. And so some people thought maybe it would be a good candidate for restoration because it produces seeds, but we're kind of moving away from that because it would be terrible to, yay, look how successful we were, and then 2 months later, it's completely gone. Yes, question.
If you wanted to go and help with the burlap and do that, where do you go?
Yes. If you wanted to help make seagrass mats, where do you go? Well, you will come to the center. So if you are signed up for the newsletter, once a month the newsletter comes out, and in that newsletter are all of our volunteer opportunities. So upcoming in April, or March and April, I think we have like 20 seagrass matting events that are happening. But these things, people are excited about it, and they fill up quickly. So the second you get the newsletter through your email, click on that link and go and sign up for a seagrass mounting event. And we would love to have you. Yeah, so the Oceanographic Center in Stewart, right on Hutchinson Island. Yes, the question was about our oyster restoration program, and yes, that's a whole other talk. I didn't have time for that, but we still bag oysters. We have oyster reef restoration program. We're also doing a living docks program, kind of moving away from doing these large-scale events in the river because, once again, just like the water quality for seagrasses, it's really not conducive to these big reef restorations. So we're kind of shifting gears a little bit to getting the oyster shells out there, but just in a different manner.
And you talked about writing your congressman and things like that. I've been writing them since the 1960s, and it's just, I'm tired.
Yeah.
And mostly to no effect.
Yeah.
Is there a state program to clean the water?
So the the comment was about writing your congressman, and this lovely woman has been writing them since 1960, and she hasn't heard, and she's tired. So I understand that. Politics is difficult. The question was, is there a state program for clean water? To clean up the water. And you know what? I am going to shunt this question to our advocacy coordinator because this is literally her bread and butter. And I know that she knows the answer to this.
And if so, is it effective?
And if there is a campaign, is it effective?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I'm Casey Darling-Niffen. I'm the advocacy coordinator at Florida Oceanographic. Thank you so much for writing for all these years. And I haven't been writing as long, but I still feel your pain. It can be a demoralizing process, but we so appreciate all the effort that you put into it because it is as an individual, your voice may feel small and not effective, but if we collectively go out there and send many, many, many letters, that becomes a political, then it becomes a force to be reckoned with, and the political will is really what we need in Florida. There have been bills that have been passed to clean up water, supposedly, to clean up water. The effect of them, the implementation of them, isn't always what we hope they will be. So it is not just we pass a bill and then the water is clean. It comes down to agencies to implement them. It comes down to these things actually, there's many, many more steps that go into it. It's a long process, but the more political will, the more we have our community engaged, the more that we all use our voices to let people in elected offices know that this is important to us, the more that we will get done. So we so appreciate what you've been doing. We hope that many more of you will. Again, please sign up for our action alerts, and please, I'll have my cards. If you would like to get involved, please email me, and we could use as many voices as possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Question in the red shirt.
We have a place in a condo association right on the river.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any kind of a pre-set document, something that we could give to our boards that talks about what an association should do with our lawns and in order for
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful suggestion. The question is there a handout, a standardized handout that can go out to condo association or HOAs? And I think that Casey has been working on that.
I just wrote it down in my notes section, so if that's what you mean by working on it, I am. That is a great idea. There's other groups and organizations that have done more work with HOAs. It's absolutely a fantastic idea to have this as a flyer, a one-page fact sheet on how you can, as a neighborhood association, as neighbors that care about water quality, what you can do to improve water quality around you. It's a great idea. Thank you. I'll work on it.
Just working on it.
We're talking about navigable waterways. Doesn't that give the feds an opportunity to come in and assist financially, pick up a lot of the burden, and maybe even bypass some Tallahassee bureaucracy? Is it possible?
Advocacy coordinator? I do research.
So for the folks on Zoom, the question was, because these are navigable waters, is there an opportunity for the feds to come in and do, I assume, large-scale restoration and use federal funding? Was that the question? Yeah. It's a good question. Yes, it's possible. Again, whether there is the political will to do this, and it all falls back really on what Lorraine was talking about in her presentation, is the water quality there to support it in the first place?
Is our congressional delegation from this area helping to do something about this, or?
So our federal, depending on where you live, yes, our congressional delegation has stated water quality as being a goal and on their platform of things that they are trying to do. Again, whether these things are implemented, whether they actually go through is another thing. And that is our job of keeping these folks accountable to what they say that they are going to do when we vote for them every 2 to 4 years.
Is it possible to select for plants that are more resistant to environmental stresses?
Yes, great question. Is it possible to select for plants that are more environmentally resistant? And there's been a lot of talk about maybe growing them in nurseries that are a little bit more, they have stressful conditions. But when it's all said and done, we're kind of the mind that we might already be doing that on accident. So the seagrasses that are washing up on the shore, they're surviving. They're out there in the lagoon right now, whereas the other ones aren't. And so those are the ones that we are planting in the nursery, and that's the ones that are going back out into the IRL. Another thing that we're actually starting to think about a lot more is the genetic diversity of these. You know, as a restoration practitioner with a nursery, you know, how many different genetic strains of seagrass do we have? And can we use that to select for the more resistant strain? And as I sell seagrass to other organizations or put it in different parts of the lagoon, you know, are we just making one big giant population of one clone? You know, we should be really making sure that we have a lot of genetic diversity. And so this is kind of go back to the conversation about how we were really caught on our heels with this huge seagrass decline, and now everyone is trying to scramble quickly to really answer these questions and get to the bottom of some of those really important things. Great question.
Is there any research going on with herbicides and seagrass?
Is there any research about herbicides and seagrass? Yes, I almost put a slide in there, talk about glyphosate. It's a big conversation. You know, a lot of people are very concerned that glyphosate makes its way into the Indian River Lagoon, and that's why all our seagrass is dead. So, you know, this is a bigger conversation, but if glyphosate was killing all the seagrass, there wouldn't be any seagrass, there wouldn't be any algae, all the caulerpa, there's so much caulerpa in the northern IRL. And so, you know, it's definitely an issue. It's definitely something that we're looking into and trying to understand a little bit more, but it's not the major issue. It didn't warrant enough conversation to put it in the threats to the seagrass and the IRL on that slide. Great question.
Could you take like seagrass from the Chesapeake and see if it would grow down here?
Can we take seagrass from the Chesapeake and see if it grows down here?
Or some other?
I think history has taught us we should not do that, right? It's been talked about, but I think that everyone is of the mind that we shouldn't be moving seagrass around. It's frowned upon even to take it from the West Coast and bring it over here. So I think that we have a slew of problems that we kind of understand right now, and so to bring something in from another place is probably not the best idea for the IRL, but it's been thought about for sure. I saw another question over here. No? Yes, blue shirt.
You talked about how what we've been seeing since 2010 or so is it's more the halophilas that have been proportionally, we're seeing more of them. It's the larger campus grasses that have died off. And you mentioned that we're thinking that it might be like a time frame of like 16 to 20 years for it to return. Has anybody looked at what factors are involved? Like, is there anything that might speed that up? Or is it just a case of, I hope we don't have another algal bloom in the next 16 to 20 years?
Yeah, the question was, can we increase the trajectory of seagrass return? And yes, clean water. That's really it. I think it just seems so simple, right? So that data that I said, the 16 to 22 years of that trajectory, so that was between 2009 and 2015. And that was when the Indian River Lagoon was still kind of stressed, right? The seagrass was coming back. And that's just a very basic back of the envelope calculation. Because where we are now, we're in a whole different playing field of where the lagoon is. And so while we have that, that 16 to 22 years from those days, people are concerned that it's actually going to be a lot longer because we are in such a detrimental place.
Now, to follow up from that, that graph you were showing, that was sort of Indian River Lagoon wide.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of these algal blooms are only occurring in parts of the IRL.
Mm-hmm.
Like there are some areas, like say perhaps Sebastian Inlet, that didn't get hit as bad by that 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is there a possibility that we can use those as sort of like, okay, can we see this go back to, can we see those canopy seagrass returning?
Yeah, so the question was just about looking at the entire extent of the IRL and how, while I'm showing one graph that is showing all of the data from the IRL, there's actually a lot of different reaches in the system. I think it was broken up into 9. I showed a quick graph with all of the transect data. And so each reach reacts very differently due to hydrology. And so areas in Sebastian Inlet, Fort Pierce, you're seeing seagrass come back much quicker because it has good hydrology. Whereas in other places, as you move north in the Banana River per se, you're not seeing that come back because of that slow turnover. And so, yeah, I mean, ideally, we would have enough time that I could sit down and we could talk about each reach and what's happening. But for a quick lecture, a dump of knowledge on you, I had to do it all. So, yeah, great question.
So we're just about out of time, but I do want to grab one question from our internet audience. We've had a lot of really good questions coming in through Zoom, but there's some of the same questions you guys have been asking here at the Blake. So I think Dr. Simpson has already answered a lot of these questions for our Zoom audience, but we haven't touched on sea level rise yet. As sea level rise introduces a higher salinity to historical seagrass habitats, what's the current perspective when it comes to seagrass habitat and associated species survival in future sea level rise scenarios?
Wow, that's a great question. Thinking about sea level rise and seagrasses. And so, thinking about increase of salinity in sea level in the Indian River Lagoon, I don't think that's going to be one of the main drivers because you're still going to have that freshwater influence that comes in. It is a brackish water ecosystem, and so because of that, you're going to have this range of salinities at all time. What is more important, in my opinion, in the sea level rise conversation is as sea level is rising, that zone where the seagrass used to live between 0.5 and 0.9 meters, now that's much deeper. And the seagrass needs to migrate up into the shoreline, essentially. And oftentimes in this area, we don't have enough room for the seagrass to migrate, or the mangroves to migrate, or the oysters to migrate. And so if it starts to become too deep and it can't migrate up in the tidal column, you're going to see a complete loss of seagrass. So that's a whole other conversation, but that's a really great question.
Unfortunately, folks, that's it for time. If you have more questions for Dr. Simpson, we could probably hang out outside for a couple minutes, but the library is closing. Can we get one more big round of applause for Dr. Simpson?
Thank you.
And just a reminder, we've got 2 weeks left. 1 week from tonight, we've got Jeff Beal from Ducks Unlimited to talk about Florida's really important wetlands. And then we're going to wrap up the series on March 14th with Dr. Edie Witter from Orca. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you again.